The dust hung thick in the air like suspended time, choking the last light from the summer evening. Martha Caldwell's wrists burned against the rough hemp rope, blood seeping into the fibers as the horse beneath her stumbled over another rock. Her captors hadn't spoken in hours, just the occasional grunt or whistle between them as they led her farther from everything she had ever known. From the ridge behind them came no sounds of pursuit, no desperate calls of her name. Only the mocking cry of a distant hawk and the hollow wind sweeping across the plains. 3 days ago, she had been making stew for her children. Now she rode toward an unthinkable fate, her thoughts fixed on the 2 small faces she feared she might never see again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trading post at Copper Creek had always been a haven of sorts, nestled in the shadow of rust-colored mesas where the territory's harshest landscape softened just enough to allow for a trickle of commerce. Martha Caldwell had come to know its weathered boards and sagging porch, as well as she knew the calluses on her hands. Every month for the past 2 years, she'd hitched her wagon and made the day-long journey from their homestead, her children. Daniel and Sarah perched behind her on the rough bench seat, their eyes wide at the prospect of seeing other human beings. This time had been different. This time she'd left 11-year-old Daniel in charge of his 8-year-old sister, with strict instructions not to leave the cabin and enough food for the 3 days she expected to be gone. The spring had been brutal, late frosts killing half their seedlings, then an early heat that withered what remained. The letter from her sister back east had arrived with the last supply wagon, containing just enough money to save them if Martha could stretch it with careful trading. "Won't be back till sundown on the 3rd day," she'd told Daniel, brushing his sandy hair from his eyes. "You remember how to use your pa's rifle if need be." It wasn't a question. The boy had been handling firearms since he was 7, when Thomas Caldwell still walked the earth. Before the fever had taken him, leaving Martha alone with 2 children and 100 acres of unforgiving earth that demanded payment in sweat and blood for every potato and turnip it grudgingly yielded. Daniel had nodded solemnly, his father's eyes staring back at her from a face still soft with youth. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah had clung to her skirts. "Bring back sugar candy," she'd whispered, as if afraid to voice the wish aloud, knowing luxury was a language they'd nearly forgotten how to speak. "Just be sure to bring yourself back," Daniel had added, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the fear he tried so hard to mask beneath his mannish posturing. Martha had kissed them both, inhaling the scent of their hair. Soap and dust and something that was uniquely theirs, a smell that followed her now, phantom-like, as she rode bound and helpless away from them. The attack had come on her return journey, her wagon loaded with meager supplies that would stretch their provisions through the worst of the coming summer. She'd been just 6 miles from home when they'd appeared. 3 riders, materializing from a gulch like demons, conjured from the earth itself. She'd reached for the ancient pistol beneath the seat, but the first rider had been on her before her. Fingers closed around the grip, yanking her from the bench with such force that her shoulder had popped with a sickening crack. "Looky what we found, boys," he'd drawled, his breath hot and reeking of tobacco against her face as he pinned her to the ground. "Bit old, but she'll fetch something from Grayson's outfit." She'd fought then, with every ounce of strength her 36-year-old body possessed, had raked her nails across his leering face, drawing blood and a stream of curses, had kicked and twisted and screamed until another of them brought the butt of his rifle down across her temple, plunging her world into darkness. She'd awakened to find herself slung across a horse like a sack of grain, her hands bound before her mouth filled with the metallic taste of blood and dust. Her wagon was nowhere to be seen, doubtless picked clean of its precious cargo and left to the elements. The lead rider, his face now bearing 4 angry furrows from her nails, had noticed her stirring and laughed. Sleeping Beauty awakens. He'd mocked. Enjoy your nap, Mrs. Caldwell. The use of her name had sent ice through her veins. These weren't random outlaws. They knew who she was. Had perhaps been watching the homestead, waiting for her to leave her children alone. My children, she'd rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Ain't our concern, he'd replied with a shrug. Not any more, anyway. Now, as the third day of their journey drew to a close and the terrain grew increasingly barren, Martha's mind returned obsessively to those words. Not any more. What did that mean? Had they left Daniel and Sarah untouched? Or had they... No, she couldn't allow her thoughts to travel that path. Her children were alive. They had to be. Daniel was smart, resourceful. He would have heard riders approaching, would have hidden Sarah, would have remembered his father's lessons about survival and danger. They were waiting for her, and somehow she would return to them. The riders called each other by name now, no longer concerned with her learning their identities. The one whose face she'd marked was Wade, clearly the leader of their small band. The youngest, barely more than a boy himself with patchy whiskers and nervous eyes, they called Emmett. The third, a hulking brute whose massive hands had dealt. The blow that knocked her unconscious answered to Thorn. "How much do you reckon Grayson will pay for her?" Emmett asked as they made camp that night. The question directed at Wade as he bound Martha's ankles together. "Enough," Wade replied, tightening the knot with unnecessary force that made Martha wince. "Word is, he lost 3 women to fever last month. Settlement that size needs women, especially ones who've proven they can bear healthy children." Martha's blood ran cold. She'd heard whispers of such places, remote outlaw camps where women were traded like cattle, forced into servitude of the vilest kind. Rumor had it they seldom survived more than a few years before disease or despair claimed them. "Waste to use her like that," Thorne grunted, his small eyes traveling over Martha with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Could keep her. Always. Use another pair of hands at the hideout," Wade snorted. "And listen to her plotting escape every night? Nah. Besides, Grayson pays in gold, not promises." He patted the knife at his belt. "She tries anything between here and delivery, I'll cut. Her pretty face. Reduce the price some, but she'll learn quick enough. They didn't bother to gag her. Out here with nothing but scrub and stone for miles, her screams would reach no ears that would care." Martha leaned against the solitary twisted juniper they'd tied her to, watching as the men settled around their small fire, passing a bottle between them. The night air grew cold quickly, desert heat fleeing skyward as darkness claimed the land. She had lost track of how far they'd traveled, but she knew they were heading southwest, deeper into contested territory where law held no sway and boundaries. Between Mexican and American lands blurred into meaninglessness. Her only consolation was that they seemed to be avoiding the highest trails. Wade's horse had thrown a shoe that morning, forcing them to stay on easier terrain. As the men's conversation devolved into drunken boasting, Martha tested her bonds for the 100th time. The rope around her wrists was crusted with her own dried blood, but she thought she felt the slightest give in one loop. Working silently, she twisted her hands, ignoring the fresh pain as the fibers bit into raw flesh. A sudden noise from beyond. Their small camp brought all movement to a halt. Something between a whistle and a bird call. It echoed briefly off the nearby rocks, then faded into silence. Wade was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Check it," he hissed to Emmett, who scrambled to obey, drawing his pistol and moving clumsily toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Thorne stood more slowly, a massive frame unfolding as he reached for the shotgun resting against his saddle. "Probably just a coyote," he rumbled, but his posture suggested he believed otherwise. Martha held her breath, hope and terror warring within her. Could it be rescued? But who would come for her? No one at the trading post had seen her captured. No one knew she was missing yet, except a shot cracked the night, followed immediately. By Emmett's strangled cry and the sound of a body hitting earth, Wade cursed, dropping to one knee and aiming into the darkness, only to have his rifle kicked violently from his hands by a shadow that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The shadow solidified into the form of a man, tall, lithe, dressed in buckskins with a red bandana knotted at his throat. His face was streaked with dark paint that made his features almost impossible to discern in the firelight, but there was no mistaking the knife in his hand as he stood over Wade, who scrambled backward like a crab. "What the hell?" Thorne roared. Raising his shotgun, the stranger moved with unnatural speed, driving his foot into the campfire and sending a spray of burning embers into Thorne's face. The big man howled, clawing at his eyes as the stranger closed the distance between them, disarming him with a savage twist that left Thorne's wrist bent at an impossible angle. The entire attack had taken less than 30 seconds. Wade had regained his feet and drawn a knife, circling warily as the stranger turned to face him. "You picked the wrong woman," the stranger said, his voice surprisingly soft, with an accent Martha couldn't place. "Back away now and live." Wade's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Who the hell are you? Her husband's long dead." "I speak for those who cannot," the stranger replied, advancing with measured steps. "The children who wait, the land you trespass upon." Martha felt her heart stutter. Her children. This man knew about her children. Wade lunged, blade slashing wildly. The stranger sidestepped with fluid grace, caught Wade's arm, and in one terrible motion drove his own knife between the outlaw's ribs. Wade made a small, surprised sound, more confusion than pain, before crumpling to the dirt. The stranger stood motionless for a moment, then methodically wiped his blade clean on Wade's shirt before turning to Martha. He approached slowly, hands held where she could see them, and knelt before her. "Martha Caldwell," he said, not a question but a statement. She nodded, unable to find her voice. His knife flashed once, twice, and her bonds fell away. As blood rushed painfully back into her limbs, she studied his face. By the dying firelight, she could see that he was not as young as his movements had suggested. Perhaps 40, with deep lines etched around eyes so dark they appeared black. His features spoke of mixed heritage, but predominantly Native American. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My children," she managed finally, her voice a rasp. "Are they alive?" he confirmed, offering a water skin. "Waiting. 4 days' ride from here." Tears sprang to her eyes as relief crashed through her. "Who are you?" she whispered. "How did you find me?" The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "I am called Thomas Black Fox," he said, "and I have been following your trail since these men took you." Martha's legs trembled as she tried to stand. "Why would you help a stranger?" Thomas Black Fox reached out a steady hand to support her elbow. "No stranger," he replied. "The boy Daniel. He found our hunting party, asked for help." A brief pause. "He has his father's courage." Martha's vision blurred with tears. Daniel had done it, had somehow found help when she couldn't return. "We should move," Thomas said, already gathering the outlaw's weapons. "Thorne still breathes. When he wakes, he will follow." Martha looked toward the horses, then down at her torn dress, her bloody wrists. 4 days' ride to reach her children, through territory she didn't know, hunted by a man who would kill her without hesitation. "I'm ready," she said, straightening her spine as new strength flowed into her limbs. Beyond the ridge, the first pale light of dawn was breaking. A new day. Thomas Black Fox nodded once, a gesture of respect rather than agreement. "Then we begin," he said simply, and handed her Wade's pistol. Dawn spilled across the desert in ribbons of amber and gold, casting long shadows from the twisted junipers and sage. Martha's muscles screamed in protest as Thomas Black Fox helped her mount one of the outlaw's horses, a sturdy pinto with a white blaze down its nose. 4 days of captivity had left her body battered, her shoulder still throbbing from where Wade had wrenched it during her capture. Thomas moved with efficient grace, stripping the camp of anything useful, weapons, supplies, water. He worked in near silence, his movements precise and economical. When he finally mounted the second horse, a tall chestnut gelding, Martha noticed how he scanned the horizon methodically, eyes narrowing at something only he could perceive. "We ride northwest," he said, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left the unconscious Thorn behind. "There is a canyon ahead where water still runs. We will find shelter there before midday." Martha nodded, surprised to find her voice had momentarily abandoned her. The reality of her rescue still felt dreamlike. A miracle materialized from the unforgiving landscape, just when all hope had fled. She studied her savior as they rode, trying to place him in a world she thought she understood. Thomas Black Fox rode as if born to it, his posture straight but relaxed, eyes constantly moving between the terrain ahead and the signs only he could read in the dust and stone around them. He had removed the paint from his face, revealing copper skin, weathered by sun and wind, high cheekbones, and a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Martha guessed him to be in his early 40s, though there was something timeless about him that made precise age difficult to determine. "How did Daniel find you?" she asked finally, breaking the silence as they navigated a narrow pass between towering red rocks. Thomas was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. "Then, the boy tracked southwest after the second day. Smart. Followed your wagon tracks until he found where they took you." His voice carried a hint of admiration. "Found our hunting party near Split Rock Creek." Martha's heart swelled with pride and pain. Daniel had known exactly what to do, had acted with a courage that belied his years. "And Sarah? My daughter?" "Safe, with the women of my sister's family." Thomas glanced at her briefly. The boy did not leave her alone. Of course, he hadn't. Daniel was his father's son, responsible beyond his years. Martha blinked back tears, refusing to give in to the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She would save her tears for when her children were in her arms again. "You tracked us for 3 days, she said. Not a question, Thomas nodded. "These men," he gestured dismissively behind them. "They leave signs like a wounded buffalo, no respect for the land they cross. But you waited to attack." A slight nod. "Watched first. Learn their patterns. 1 man against 3 requires patience." Martha considered this, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since her rescue. "Why help us? We're strangers to your people." Thomas rode silently for several minutes before answering. "Not all strangers are enemies," he said finally. "Your boy spoke of you with honor, said you traded fairly with all people, taught him to respect the land." He paused. "And your husband once helped my cousin when others would not." Martha's breath caught. "Thomas, my husband helped your cousin?" 5 winters ago. Your husband found Key bloody on the trail, shot by hunters who mistook him for a deer. Bring him to your home, cared for him until he could ride again." Thomas's dark eyes met hers. "We do not forget such acts." Martha remembered it well, a young native man, barely conscious, whom Thomas Caldwell had carried into their cabin, despite the protests of neighbors who'd suggested they leave the Indian to his fate. Her husband had been firm. "A man's a man," he'd said simply, "and this one needs help." The young man had stayed with them for nearly 2 weeks, recovering from a bullet wound that had shattered his collarbone. He'd spoken little but had carved a small wooden wolf for Daniel before departing. Martha had never learned his name. "Key is your cousin," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "My sister's son." The debt was clear, though Thomas hadn't named it as such. A life for a life. Honor repaid. Martha swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said simply. They rode in silence after that. The rhythm of the horses' hooves and the occasional call of a hawk, the only sounds breaking the vast stillness of the landscape. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it heat that shimmered off the rocks and baked the dusty earth. By mid-morning, Martha's lips were cracked, her throat parched despite the water Thomas had shared during brief stops. Just as the sun reached its zenith, they entered a narrow canyon. The temperature dropped immediately as high stone walls blocked the worst of the sun's assault. A thin ribbon of water trickled along one side, fed by an underground spring. The sound of it was almost musical after hours of dust and heat. "We rest here," Thomas announced, dismounting with fluid grace. 2 hours, no more." Martha slid from her saddle less elegantly, her legs buckling as they hit the ground. Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her without comment. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "I'm not usually—" "You have endured much," he interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "Rest, eat, your strength will return." He led the horses to water, then moved with practiced efficiency to secure their small camp. Martha watched him, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, the thought of placing her safety, her very life, in the hands of a Navajo hunter would have seemed impossible. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thomas returned with strips of dried meat and a handful of berries. "Not much," he acknowledged, "but it will sustain until evening." Martha accepted the food gratefully. "You seem to know this territory well." "My people have walked these lands for generations," he replied, settling cross-legged on a flat rock, his back straight, eyes still scanning their surroundings. "Every stone has a story. Every path leads somewhere known to us." She nodded, chewing the tough, salty meat slowly. "And the men who took me, where were they taking me?" Thomas's expression darkened. "There is a place 3 days' ride southwest, a camp of outlaws and deserters, men without honor who trade in things that should not be traded." His gaze met hers briefly. "Women are scarce in these territories." Martha suppressed a shudder. "You mentioned a man named Grayson, Jacob Grayson, once a soldier, now something worse. He rules the camp through fear and promises. Trades with raiders and renegades from both sides of the border." Thomas's voice remained level, but Martha sensed the contempt beneath his words. "His kind are like scorpions. They bring only poison to the land." "And Thorn, the one who survived?" Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to the knife at his belt. "He will recover. He will follow." "Why not kill him then?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended, surprising even herself with its brutality. Thomas studied her for a long moment. "Would that bring you peace?" "No," she admitted, "but it would bring safety." "Perhaps." He looked toward the canyon entrance. "But killing awakens ghosts. Sometimes it is better to leave a man with his shame." Martha wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. Thomas knew this wild country and its unwritten laws far better than she. If he believed Thorn would follow, she had no reason to doubt him. They rested beneath the shade of the canyon walls, the cool stone a blessing against Martha's sunburned skin. Despite her resolve to stay alert, exhaustion pulled her into a fitful doze. She dreamed of her children, Daniel's serious face as he took the rifle from her hands, Sarah's small fingers braiding wildflowers into crowns. In her dream, shadows gathered at the edges of their homestead, circling closer with each passing moment. She woke with a start to find Thomas crouched beside her, one hand lightly touching her shoulder. "We must move," he said simply. "There is dust on the horizon." All traces of sleep fled instantly. "Thorn?" Thomas nodded, already moving to gather their meager supplies. "He found horses, not alone now." Fear clawed at Martha's throat. "How many?" "3. Maybe 4. Thomas handed her the reins to her pinto. They are still distant, but gaining. Martha mounted swiftly, ignoring the protest of her aching muscles. Where do we go? Not back the way we came. No, Thomas agreed, swinging onto his own horse. We go deeper into the canyon. There are paths there unknown to outsiders. As they rode deeper into the shadowed cleft, the walls narrowed until barely 2 riders could pass abreast. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying scents of moss and mineral. Martha glimpsed pictographs on some of the higher walls, ancient symbols left by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. Thomas rode with renewed urgency, occasionally glancing over his shoulder. The canyon divides ahead, he explained, as they navigated around a massive boulder that had fallen from above. One path leads to a dead end, the other climbs to a plateau. And our pursuers won't know which is which, Martha finished, understanding, dawning. Thomas's mouth quivered in what might have been a ghost of a smile. They may guess correctly, but the plateau offers advantages they will not expect. The fork appeared suddenly, 2 nearly identical passages splitting like the tongue of a snake. Without hesitation, Thomas led them into the left branch, where the grade immediately began to steepen. The horses labored, hooves slipping occasionally on loose shale. The walls pressed closer, and Martha had to duck to avoid low-hanging rock formations. "How much farther?" she asked, breathless. "Not far. The plateau opens soon." Thomas glanced back again. "Listen." Martha strained her ears and caught it, the distant clatter of hooves on stone echoing through the canyon they'd left behind. Thorn and his new companions had found their trail. "Ride," Thomas urged, spurring his mount forward. "We must reach higher ground before they enter the canyon." They emerged onto the plateau just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Martha gasped involuntarily at the view. Miles of rugged terrain spread before them, painted in shades of amber, crimson, and gold by the late afternoon light. In the far distance, blue mountains rose like sentinels against the sky. Thomas didn't pause to admire the vista. He led them to a cluster of wind-carved rock formations near the plateau's edge, where the ground fell away sharply back to the canyon floor. "Dismount," he instructed, sliding from his saddle. "Quickly!" Martha obeyed, watching as Thomas led the horses behind the largest rock formation. To her surprise, he began removing their saddles. "What are you doing?" she asked, bewildered. "We need to keep moving." Thomas shook his head. "The horses go free from here." At her startled expression, he added, "It is necessary, trust me." Before Martha could protest further, a sound reached them. Voices echoing up from the canyon path they'd just climbed. Thorn and his men had chosen correctly at the fork. "Come," Thomas whispered urgently, taking her arm. "Now we become ghosts." Thomas led Martha to a narrow crevice between 2 towering rock formations, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The opening was tight. Martha had to turn sideways to squeeze through, but it widened into a small alcove, sheltered from sun and wind and, most importantly, from sight. "Stay low," Thomas instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. He removed a small pouch from his belt and sprinkled what looked like dried herbs and earth around the entrance. "This will mask our scent." Martha crouched beside him, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain their pursuers would hear it echoing off the stone walls. "The horses will draw them away," Thomas finished. "When released, they will seek water and open ground. Thorn and his men will follow the tracks." As if on cue, they heard the distant thunder of hoofbeats as their freed mounts galloped across the plateau. Shouts followed, men's voices raised in confusion, then determination. "There they go." "Don't lose them! Spread out!" Thomas didn't move a muscle, his body coiled with the patient tension of a predator. Martha tried to match his stillness, fighting against the trembling in her limbs. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the plateau. The voices grew fainter, then returned, agitated and angry. Tracks just stop here. They can't have vanished. Maybe they went over the edge. Heavy footsteps approached their hiding place. Martha held her breath as a shadow fell across the narrow opening of their refuge. Someone was standing mere feet away, separated from them only by the thin veil of Thomas's clever concealment. "Nothing here but rocks and dust," a gravelly voice announced. Thorne's voice, unmistakable in its brutal cadence. "They must have doubled back somehow." "Or they're holed up somewhere," another man suggested. "These canyons are full of caves and hidey holes." "Then we search every damn one," Thorne growled. "I ain't letting that woman slip away. Grayson will pay triple now that she's killed Wade." "It'll be dark soon," a third voice pointed out. "We could break our necks stumbling." Around these cliffs at night, a tense silence followed, broken by the sound of thorns spitting on the ground. "We make camp at the base of the plateau," he decided finally. "Set a watch on both canyon exits. Come first light, we hunt them down proper." The footsteps receded. Only when the last echo had faded did Thomas move, placing a restraining hand on Martha's arm as she shifted position. "Not yet," he breathed. "They may leave someone behind." They waited in silence as darkness claimed the plateau. The temperature dropped rapidly, the desert giving up its stored heat to the night sky. Martha shivered, her thin dress offering little protection against the growing chill. Without a word, Thomas removed his buckskin jacket and draped it across her shoulders. She started to protest, but he silenced her with a slight shake of his head. When the stars were bright pinpricks against the velvet sky, Thomas finally moved toward the entrance of their hiding place. He listened intently, then slipped outside with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. Martha waited, counting her heartbeats until he returned. "They've gone down to the canyon floor," he reported. "2 camps, one at each exit." "We're trapped," Martha whispered, despair threatening to overwhelm her. Thomas shook his head. "There is another way. One they do not know." He helped her from their shelter and led her through the maze of rock formations, moving with uncanny sureness. Despite the darkness, the plateau stretched before them, a darker shadow against the star-strewn sky. In the distance, the glow of campfires marked their enemies' positions. Instead of heading away from the fires, Thomas guided her along the very edge of the plateau, where the ground fell away in a sheer drop to the canyon below. "There," he said, pointing to what appeared to be nothing but shadow. As they drew closer, Martha saw it, a narrow trail, barely wider than a man's foot, zigzagging down the cliff. "Face." "We can't possibly," she began. "We can. We must." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "I will go first. Follow exactly where I step." Her protest died unspoken. They had no choice. She nodded, swallowing her fear. Thomas began the descent, moving with the sure-footed confidence of one who had traveled this path before. Martha followed, pressing herself against the cliff face, focusing solely on the placement of each foot. The trail was treacherous. Loose shale sometimes skittered away beneath her boots, plummeting into the darkness below. Once she slipped, a strangled gasp escaping her lips before Thomas's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with iron strength until she regained her footing. Time lost all meaning on that vertical path. It might have been minutes or hours before they reached a small ledge jutting from the cliff face, barely large enough for both of them to stand upon. "Rest," Thomas instructed, his breathing steady despite the ordeal. Martha leaned against the rock wall, legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. "How much farther?" "Halfway," he replied. "The next part is easier, less steep." She nodded, too spent for words. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming in protest at the unaccustomed strain, but something else burned within her, a fierce determination that grew stronger with each passing hour. Every step took her closer to her children. Every painful breath was one more victory against those who would have stolen her future. Thomas studied her face in the faint starlight. "You are stronger than you know," he observed quietly. "I'm a mother," she replied simply. "I don't have the luxury of weakness." A look of understanding passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended their different worlds. Then Thomas turned back to the path. "We continue." The descent resumed, marginally less harrowing, as the incline gentled. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the landscape. Thomas led her immediately into the shelter of a rocky overhang, where they crouched in the shadows. "We are between their camps now," he whispered. "We must move silently and stay near the canyon walls." Martha nodded, following as Thomas picked his way through the boulder-strewn terrain. They skirted massive rock formations, using them as shields against potential watchful eyes. The air at the canyon floor was surprisingly humid, carrying the scent of water and growing things. After what seemed like miles of careful progress, Thomas paused beside a curtain of hanging vines that partially concealed a dark opening in the canyon wall. Without hesitation, he parted the vegetation and motioned for Martha to enter. She hesitated only briefly before ducking into the darkness. Thomas followed, letting the vines fall back into place behind them. Inside, the air was cooler, damper. Martha could hear the soft plink of water droplets falling from somewhere above. "What is this place?" she whispered. "An old dwelling place," Thomas replied, his voice echoing slightly. "My people used it generations ago, before moving to higher ground." As her eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness, Martha could make out the outlines of the cave, larger than she'd first thought, with smooth walls that bore faint traces of ancient handprints and painted symbols. Thomas moved deeper into the cave, retrieving something from a recess in the wall. A moment later, a small flame sputtered to life as he lit a fat, waxy candle. "No one comes here now," he explained, setting the candle on a natural shelf of rock. "But we keep supplies in sacred places, for emergencies." By the candle's glow, Martha saw that the cave was indeed prepared. A small cache of supplies was tucked into a dry corner. Folded blankets, a water skin, dried foodstuffs, even a small stone pot. Against the far wall, crude pictographs depicted hunts and ceremonies from long ago. Handprints in red ochre marked one section of the cave, some large, others small enough to belong to children. "Your people think of everything," she murmured, running her fingers over the smooth stone wall. "We have learned to survive in this land," Thomas replied simply. "When every season brings new challenges, preparation becomes instinct." He reached into a small niche and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Inside were dried herbs and what looked like strips of jerky, preserved dark and hard with age. "This has been here for months, perhaps a year," he explained, testing a piece between his fingers. "Still good." He handed her a strip of the jerky and a pouch of something that smelled faintly of mint. "Tea," he said, seeing her questioning glance. "To restore strength." Thomas filled the stone pot with water from the skin and positioned it carefully over the candle flame. The arrangement was so practiced that Martha realized he had done this many times before, in this very spot. "You've used this place often," she observed. Thomas nodded. "As a boy, I came here with my father, later as a scout." Something in his expression softened. "It is a place between worlds, safe." As they waited for the water to heat, Thomas showed her marks carved into the stone floor near the entrance, tiny symbols that at first glance appeared to be natural formations in the rock. "Messages," he explained, "for those who know how to read them. Direction, danger, safety." He pointed to one particular marking. "This one means water nearby." When the tea was ready, Thomas poured it into 2 small cups that Martha hadn't noticed before, tucked beside the supplies. The warm liquid spread through her, chasing away some of the bone-deep chill she'd carried since her capture. He handed her one of the blankets. "Sleep now. We leave before dawn." Martha accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders as she settled onto the smooth stone floor. Despite her exhaustion, sleep evaded her. Her mind raced with images of her children, of the outlaws pursuing them, of the strange twists of fate that had led her to this moment. Thomas sat cross-legged near the entrance, still as a statue, his profile sharp against the faint light filtering through the vine curtain. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked softly. "When necessary," he replied without turning. After a pause, he added, "Rest. I will watch." "Thomas," she said after a moment, using his first name for the first time, "how much farther to my children?" Now he did turn, his dark eyes reflecting the candle's flame. "2 days if we move fast, 3 if we must be cautious." "And will we need to be cautious?" "Yes," he answered honestly. "Thorn will not give up easily. There is too much at stake for him." Martha considered this. "Because of the money Grayson would pay?" "Partly." Thomas was silent for a moment. "But also because you have wounded his pride. Men like Thorn do not forget such things." She thought of the massive outlaw, his small eyes burning with malice. No, such men did not forgive or forget. She had seen the same hatred in the eyes of men back east, men who believed women should know their place and accept whatever fate men decreed for them. "I won't be sold," she said quietly, the words emerging with a steel that surprised even her. "Not to Grayson, not to anyone. I'd rather die fighting." Thomas regarded her steadily. "I believe you would," he said finally. "But that will not be necessary. We will reach your children." His certainty calmed her somewhat. She settled back against the cave wall, allowing her eyes to close at last. "Tell me about your family," she murmured, seeking distraction from her fears. "You mentioned a sister." Thomas was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then his voice came low and measured in the darkness. "My sister is called Anna," he said. "She married a man from another clan. They have 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl." A pause. "My parents joined the ancestors many seasons ago. I have cousins to the north and east." "No wife? Children of your own?" The question slipped out before Martha could consider its propriety. Again, that long silence. "There was a wife once," he said finally. "She did not survive the birth of our son. He did not survive either." "I'm sorry," Martha said softly, hearing the old pain beneath his measured tone. "It was long ago," Thomas replied, though something in his voice suggested the wound had never fully healed. "After, I chose to walk alone, to serve my people as scout and hunter." Martha thought of her own loss, of Thomas Caldwell's final days, consumed by fever, slipping away despite her desperate prayers and remedies. The emptiness that followed had been boundless, alleviated only by the needs of her children. "It's never truly long ago," she observed quietly. "Not when you've loved someone." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cave walls. "Her name was Morning Sky," he said finally, the words emerging as if drawn from some deep well within him. "She had hands that could weave the finest baskets, eyes that missed nothing." He touched the red bandana on his throat. "She made this. Said red would keep the spirits away when I hunted alone." "Did you believe her?" Martha asked gently. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I believed in her. It was enough." His fingers fell away from the bandana. "She died in the winter. Snow fell for 3 days after. The elders said the sky was mourning." "And your son?" He never drew breath. Thomas's voice was steady, but Martha heard the cost of that steadiness. "I carved him a bow anyway, a small one. Left it with him when they were buried." Martha nodded, understanding the need to give gifts to those who had passed beyond. She had placed Thomas Caldwell's favorite pipe in his hands before they nailed his coffin shut, had whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep about watching over their children. "I talk to my husband sometimes," she admitted. "When the children can't hear, tell him about their growth, about the hardships." She drew the blanket tighter, around her shoulders. "I don't know if he hears." "He hears," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "The dead walk beside us, even when we cannot see their footprints." "It's never truly long ago," she repeated softly. "Not when you've loved someone." Thomas made no reply, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a barely perceptible relaxation of his shoulders, as if some small barrier had been crossed. The candle guttered in a faint draught, sending shadows dancing across his face. The candle guttered lower, casting elongated shadows across the cave walls. Outside, the night deepened toward that darkest hour before dawn. Despite her racing thoughts, exhaustion finally claimed Martha, pulling her down into dreamless sleep. She woke to Thomas's hand on her shoulder, gentle but urgent. "We must go," he whispered. "Now." Martha was instantly alert, the fog of sleep vanishing as she registered the tension in his face. "What is it?" "Riders. Coming from the east, many of them." She sat up, already reaching for her boots. "How many?" 8, perhaps 10. Thomas moved to the cave entrance, parting the vines just enough to peer through. "They've made camp at the eastern canyon entrance, blocking our path." "Thorn?" Thomas shook his head. "Not Thorn. These are different men. Their horses carry the army brand, but the men don't move like soldiers." His expression darkened. "Deserters, likely. Or bounty hunters using stolen army mounts." Bounty hunters. The word sent a chill through Martha. "For us? Perhaps." Thomas's face was grim. "Or perhaps just looking for anyone worth selling. Either way, we cannot be found." He was already gathering their few supplies, moving with swift efficiency. Outside, the first hint of dawn lightened the sky to a deep indigo. Martha folded the blanket and rose, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. "They've positioned men at both canyon entrances," Thomas explained, as he carefully extinguished the candle. "I count 3 campfires. They know someone is here. They're conducting a deliberate search." Martha felt cold fear settling in her stomach. "How could they know? Did someone see us?" "No," Thomas frowned, considering. "But Thorn may have allies. In unexpected places, word travels in the desert, even when we don't see the messengers." He shouldered the small pack of supplies. "The canyon will be watched now. We must take another route." "How?" Martha asked, following him deeper into the cave. "Is there another way out?" Thomas's answer was to lead her around a bend in the passage, where the ceiling dropped so low they had to stoop. The passageway narrowed further, then opened suddenly into a larger chamber, where the soft sound of flowing water echoed from unseen walls. "This way," Thomas said, his voice barely audible above the water's gentle music. "Watch your step." They waded through ankle-deep water, so cold that Martha gasped at first contact. The passage twisted through the stone, sometimes narrowing, until they had to turn sideways to pass. Other times, opening into chambers where water dripped from stalactites overhead. In one such chamber, Thomas paused, holding up his hand for silence. Far behind them, Martha heard it, voices echoing through the cave system, distorted by stone and distance, but unmistakably human. The hunters had found the cave. "They have trackers," Thomas whispered, his expression grim. "Good ones." Martha fought against the panic rising in her throat. "They'll follow us." Not easily. Thomas pointed to where their path entered the stream. "Water hides tracks, and there are other tricks." He reached into his pouch and withdrew a handful of dried leaves, crushing them between his palms and scattering them in the water behind them. This will confuse their sense of smell. And this, he pressed his hand against a seemingly ordinary section of wall which shifted slightly, revealing a hidden mark beneath, will mislead those who think they understand our ways. They continued deeper into the earth, the passage now following the underground stream's course. The air grew warmer, surprisingly so, and carried a faint mineral scent. Ahead, a dim glow became visible. Not daylight, but something else. The passage opened into a large cavern where pools of steaming water dotted the stone floor. In the center, a larger pool glowed with an eerie blue-green phosphorescence, casting enough light to see by. "Hot springs," Thomas explained, "sacred to my people. The waters here heal and protect." "It's beautiful," Martha breathed, momentarily, forgetting their pursuers. Yes, there was reverence in Thomas's voice. "Few outsiders have seen this place." He led her around the edge of the cavern to where another passage began, this one sloping gently upward. "This leads to the surface, far from the canyon mouth. We will emerge in the shadow of Twin Buttes." As they began the ascent, Martha felt a curious mix of fear and hope rising within her. The beauty of the hidden springs seemed a promise somehow, that there were still wonders in the world, still places untouched by men like Thorne and Grayson. "How much farther to my children?" she asked again, needing the anchor of that thought. "Once we reach the surface, we travel northwest," Thomas replied. "If we can find horses, perhaps by nightfall tomorrow. If not, the day after." Martha nodded, gathering her strength. Almost there, so close now. She thought of Daniel's serious face, of Sarah's small hands. They were waiting. They needed her. Nothing else mattered. "My husband used to say that trouble is just a detour, not a destination," she said quietly as they climbed. "I didn't always believe him, but now—" "He was wise," Thomas replied. "The path is never straight, but it leads where it must." The passage grew steadily brighter as they neared the surface. Ahead, Martha could see daylight filtering through what appeared to be a curtain of hanging vines. Thomas paused before they reached the exit, listening intently. "Clear," he said after a moment, "but we must be cautious. The desert has many eyes." Martha followed him to the cave mouth, preparing to step back into the world of sun and sky and danger. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For her children, for herself, for the freedom that no one had the right to take from her. In the soft dawn light, Thomas reached back and briefly clasped her hand, as if sensing her resolve. "Forward," he said simply, and forward they went, into whatever the new day might bring. The landscape beyond the cave mouth was nothing like the canyon they had left behind. Rolling hills stretched before them, dotted with juniper and pinyon pine, the ground carpeted with sage and prairie grass. In the distance, twin rock formations jutted against the sky, the Twin Buttes Thomas had mentioned, their edges gilded by the rising sun. Thomas studied the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the growing light. "We are north of your homestead now," he explained. "Those hills to the west mark the boundary of Navajo hunting grounds." Martha tried to orient herself, but the unfamiliar terrain offered no landmarks she recognized. She had never ventured this far north of their settlement and had never had reason to. Few settlers did. This was contested land, claimed by both natives and the territorial government, traveled mainly by hunters, scouts, and those with business they preferred to conduct beyond the reach of law. "How far are your people?" she asked, scanning the open country with apprehension. After the shelter of the cave, the exposed landscape felt dangerous, as if unfriendly eyes might be watching from any direction. "Half a day's walk," Thomas replied, "but we will not go there directly. Too predictable." He led her down a gentle slope, keeping to the shadows of the larger trees whenever possible. Their pace was brisk despite Martha's fatigue and the lingering stiffness in her muscles. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. The jerky and tea from the night before had not been enough to restore her strength after days of captivity and flight. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas paused in the shelter of a massive old juniper and retrieved something from his pouch. He handed her what looked like a twisted stick of dark, dried meat. Pemmican, he explained. Meat, fat, berries. Good for strength. Martha accepted it gratefully, biting into the dense, chewy substance. The taste was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Rich and slightly sweet, with a gamey undertone that suggested deer or elk. Energy seemed to flow back into her limbs as she ate. They continued northwest, maintaining a steady pace through terrain that gradually transitioned from wooded hills to more open country. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Martha's dress clung to her back with sweat. Thomas moved with the same tireless stride, but she noticed how his eyes constantly swept their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. When they created a small rise, Thomas suddenly dropped to one knee, gesturing for Martha to do the same. Below them, perhaps half a mile distant, a small party of riders moved across the plain. Even at this distance, the glint of metal was visible. Rifles and what might have been badges. Militia, Thomas murmured. Territorial volunteers. Are they looking for us? Martha whispered, stomach clenching with renewed fear. Thomas studied the riders, who had paused near a dry creek bed. Perhaps, or for Thorne and his men, or simply patrolling. He frowned. They ride in too many directions, disorganized, not army-trained. They watched as the militia split up, 3 riders heading south while 2 continued west. Thomas waited until they were tiny specks on the horizon before signaling that it was safe to continue. We should avoid open ground, he decided, altering their course slightly to skirt along a line of rocky outcroppings that would provide better cover. As they walked, Martha found herself studying Thomas with new questions forming in her mind. He navigated this harsh country with absolute confidence, knew the movements of both native peoples and white settlers, understood the tactics of trackers and militia alike. He was more than simply a hunter. You were a scout, she said finally. For the army. Thomas's step faltered almost imperceptibly before he continued. Yes, he acknowledged after a moment. 3 years, during the last campaign. Martha absorbed this. She had heard of native scouts employed by the army, men who knew the territory intimately, who could track enemies across terrain that baffled white soldiers. But such men were often viewed with suspicion by both sides of the conflict. Why? She asked simply. Thomas was silent for several paces. It is not simple, he said finally. My people were divided. Some believed fighting was the only way. Others saw it would bring only death. His expression remained impassive, but something in his voice changed. I chose to walk between, to guide soldiers away from our villages, to prevent massacres when possible. And did you prevent them? Sometimes. The word carried the weight of many memories, few of them pleasant. Not always. Martha nodded, understanding both what he said and what remained unspoken. Choices made in desperate times were rarely clean or easy. She had made her own difficult decisions in the years since her husband's death, compromises and sacrifices that kept her children fed and sheltered. When other options failed, by late afternoon, they reached a series of steep ravines cut deep into the earth by ancient floods. Thomas led her down into one of these, where the temperature dropped immediately and vegetation grew more lush, feeding on the moisture that collected in the shadowed depths. We rest here, he announced, gesturing toward a hollow beneath an overhanging ledge. Until dark. Martha sank down gratefully, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Thomas disappeared briefly, returning with a handful of small yellow berries which he offered silently. They were tart but refreshing, bursting with juice that eased her parched throat. "When we reach your people," she asked after they had eaten, "what then?" Thomas settled cross-legged near the ravine's edge, where he could watch the approaches. "We collect your children, then decide what comes next." "And what might that be?" Martha pressed, needing to plan, to prepare for whatever awaited them. "We can't return to our homestead, not with Thorn still searching." "No," Thomas agreed, "not immediately." "Then where?" "The nearest proper settlement is Fort Collins, but that's 4 days' hard ride south." Martha twisted her hands in her lap, frustration building. "We have no horses, no supplies. Winter will come soon. The children—" "Your children are safe," Thomas interrupted gently. "And you will be too. There are options." "What options?" Martha demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. The strain of the past days, the worry for her children, the uncertainty of their future, it all pressed down upon her, overwhelming her usual composure. Thomas studied her for a long moment. "There is a place," he said finally. "A settlement. In the western mountains, mixed people, some Navajo, some Ute, some white, traders mostly, those who choose to live apart from both worlds." He paused. "They would welcome a woman who can work, who knows farming, who respects the old ways." Martha stared at him, trying to process this unexpected suggestion. "You're saying we should just disappear? Start over somewhere else?" "Until Thorn is no longer a threat, until Grayson forgets." Thomas met her gaze directly. "Unless you have another plan." She didn't, and they both knew it. Her homestead was vulnerable, isolated. Even if they managed to return safely, how long before Thorn, or men like him, found them again? How many nights would she lie awake, rifle across her lap, listening for hoofbeats? "I don't know these people," she said finally. "This settlement." "No," Thomas acknowledged, "but I do. My cousin trades with them. Some were once soldiers, some were outcasts. All chose a different path." "What's it called?" "This settlement. The whites call it Shadowbrook. My people call it the place between worlds." Thomas leaned back, gazing up at the strip of sky visible above the ravine. "It sits in a valley where 3 mountain ridges meet. Good water, sheltered from the worst storms. Enough flat land for crops." Martha tried to picture it, a hidden valley with a mix of peoples living together, away from the conflicts that plagued the territories. It seemed too idealistic, too improbable to be real. "How do they defend themselves?" she asked, practical concerns pushing to the forefront. "Surely the army or outlaws or the location is its defense," Thomas explained. "One narrow pass, easily guarded. Winter closes it completely for 4 moons. And they have an arrangement with the territorial governor. They supply horses, information about outlaw movements. In return, they are left alone. A bargain with both sides," Martha mused. "Precarious, yes," Thomas admitted, "but it has been held for 8 years now. The elders there are wise. They understand balance." Martha considered this, weighing the uncertainty of a new beginning against the dangers of trying to reclaim their old life. "The children would need schooling," she said slowly. "Books, learning. There is a woman there, a teacher from the east. She keeps a small school. And winter supplies? We'd need—" "Martha," Thomas interrupted again, something like amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "You plan battles not yet fought. First, we reach your children. Then you decide." His expression softened slightly. "I offer options, not commands." She nodded, feeling strangely chastened. Of course he was right. First things first. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It's just, I've been alone so long, making every decision, carrying every burden." "You are not alone now," Thomas said simply. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away, unsure how to respond to the unexpected comfort they offered. Thomas rose smoothly to his feet, tactfully changing the subject. "I will scout ahead. Rest while you can." Martha watched him climb the ravine wall with effortless grace, disappearing over the rim into the gathering dusk. Left alone, she leaned back against the cool stone, closing her eyes for what she intended to be just a moment. Before exhaustion claimed her completely, she found herself taking proper stock of her condition for the first time since her rescue. Her dress was torn in several places, stained with dirt and her own blood from the initial struggle with Wade. Her boots, once sturdy, were splitting at the seams from the arduous travel. Raising her hands, she saw that her nails were broken, her palms crossed with cuts and scratches. She could only imagine what her face looked like, bruised, certainly, wind-burned and sun-baked. She thought of how she would appear to her children after all this. Would they even recognize their mother in this battered, wild-looking woman? Would Sarah be frightened? Would Daniel look at her with that too-old concern that sometimes seemed to age him before her eyes? Fumbling at her throat, Martha found that the small silver locket Thomas Caldwell had given her on their wedding day still hung on its worn leather cord. It had survived the capture, the flight, everything. Inside were tiny portraits of Daniel and Sarah, painted by a traveling artist, who had passed through Copper Creek the previous spring. She'd traded a month's worth of eggs and butter for those small likenesses. She rubbed her thumb over the tarnished surface, feeling its familiar contours. Some things endured, some connections remained unbroken. Exhaustion claimed her then, pulling her down into a sleep deeper than any she had known since her capture. She dreamed of her homestead, not as it was when she left it, struggling and sparse, but as it had been in those first hopeful months after they arrived from Missouri. Thomas Caldwell stood tall in the newly plowed fields, sunlight on his face, as he described the orchard they would plant, the barn they would raise. Daniel toddling after a butterfly, Sarah not yet born but growing within her. Dreams that had seemed so attainable then, before drought and disease and the harsh realities of frontier life had worn them down to mere survival. A hand on her shoulder jolted her awake. Martha gasped, disoriented, reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," Thomas's voice came, low and calm in the darkness. "It's time." She blinked, her dream dissolving as reality reasserted itself. Night had fallen completely, the ravine now illuminated only by starlight filtering down from above. Thomas was a shadow against shadows, his form barely discernible. "What did you find?" she asked, rising stiffly. "Horses," he replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. "A small ranch 2 miles north. Poor security." Martha frowned. "You mean to steal them?" "Borrow," Thomas corrected. "We will leave payment." "What payment?" "We have nothing." Thomas patted his belt pouch. "I have trade beads, turquoise. More than fair exchange for 2 horses we will ride hard and abandon near your homestead." Martha wanted to argue theft was theft, regardless of what name you gave it or what compensation you left behind. But pragmatism won out over principle. They needed horses desperately. And Thomas was right. They would leave them for their rightful owners to reclaim once their purpose was served. "Very well," she conceded. "What's your plan?" Thomas outlined it swiftly. A simple approach that relied more on stealth than confrontation. The ranch was small, just a cabin and corral, with 2 men who appeared to be brothers. They kept a dozen horses and would not immediately miss 2 taken from the farthest corner of the corral in the dead of night. "These men," Martha asked as they prepared to set out, "who are they?" "Homesteaders," Thomas replied, "new to this territory. Their brand is not registered with the territorial office." A slight frown crossed his features. "They built on an old Navajo burial ground, were warned but did not listen." Martha absorbed this information, understanding the subtle implication. These weren't innocent settlers in Thomas's eyes. They had disrespected the land and its history, ignored warnings that would have allowed them to live in harmony with their surroundings. "And the payment you mentioned?" Thomas removed a small leather pouch from his belt and shook several items into his palm. 3 turquoise stones, beautifully polished, each the size of a child's thumbnail, and a handful of intricately carved bone beads, worth more than 2 horses, he said simply. "To those who understand value." Martha nodded, wondering if the homesteaders would recognize the worth of what they were left, or if they would simply curse the theft of their animals. Different worlds, different values, the eternal conflict of the frontier. They set out immediately, climbing from the ravine and making their way north across the rolling terrain. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead in a band so bright it cast faint shadows. Martha followed Thomas's lead, moving as quietly as her exhausted body would allow, staying low when he signaled and freezing in place when he raised his hand in warning. The ranch appeared just where Thomas had described, a small cabin with a single window glowing yellow with lamplight, a corral stretching behind it where dark shapes of horses stood or lay in peaceful repose. No dogs barked as they approached, keeping to the deepest shadows. Thomas motioned for Martha to wait at the edge of the property while he crept forward, a shadow among shadows. She held her breath, watching as he reached the corral fence, slipped over it with fluid grace, and moved among the horses. Minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, imagining all the things that could go wrong. The horses might panic, the ranchers might emerge, a guard dog previously unseen might raise the alarm. But none of these things happened. Instead, Thomas emerged from the corral leading 2 horses, a dun mare and a bay gelding, their hooves muffled by what looked like cloth wrapped around each foot. He had bridled them, but carried no saddles, clearly prioritizing speed and silence over comfort. Martha met him at the property's edge, accepting the reins of the mare with hands that trembled slightly from tension and anticipation. Thomas mounted, the bay in one smooth motion, then reached down to help Martha onto her own horse. The mare shifted nervously beneath her, sensing her anxiety, but didn't whinny or bolt. They rode away from the ranch on a walk, Thomas leading them on a circuitous route that avoided the cabin and outbuildings entirely. Only when they were well beyond sight of the ranch did he remove the cloth from the horses' hooves and urge them into a ground-eating trot. The night passed in a blur of motion as they rode southwest, Thomas setting a pace that was demanding but not punishing for the horses. Martha's body ached from the unaccustomed position. It had been days since she'd ridden and never bareback for such a distance, but she made no complaint. Each hoofbeat brought her closer to her children. As they rode, Thomas shared occasional observations about the land they crossed, pointing out landmarks visible only to his trained eye, explaining how the patterns of vegetation revealed the presence of underground springs, identifying the tracks of animals that had passed before them. It was as if he were gradually introducing her to the true nature of the country she had lived in, but never truly known. "The settlers see empty land," he remarked, as they crossed a seemingly barren stretch of plateau. "My people see a living world. Every stone has a story. Every plant serves a purpose." He dismounted briefly to gather several small, unremarkable-looking, grey leaves from a low-growing plant. "Fever medicine," he explained, tucking them into his pouch. "Rare in these parts." Martha watched him with new awareness. How much had she missed in her years on the frontier? How many useful plants had she dismissed as weeds? How many signs and warnings had she failed to read in the landscape around her homestead? The world Thomas inhabited was layered with meaning and knowledge she had never bothered to seek. "I could learn," she found herself saying, "about the plants, the medicines." Thomas glanced at her, something like approval in his expression. "Yes," he agreed simply, "you could." Dawn found them crossing a wide plateau dotted with stunted trees and lichen-covered boulders. In the distance, a range of low mountains shimmered in the early light. Thomas reined in his mount atop a rise, waiting for Martha to join him. "There," he said, pointing toward a valley nestled between two sloping ridges. "My sister's winter camp." Martha shaded her eyes, straining to see. At this distance, the camp was little more than a collection of small, dark shapes against the lighter ground, with thin columns of smoke rising into the still morning air. But somewhere, in that distant settlement, were Daniel and Sarah waiting for her. Her heart leapt, then immediately constricted with fear. What if something had happened in her absence? What if— "They are well," Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts. "My people would have sent a signal if anything had changed." Martha nodded, swallowing against the knot in her throat. "How much farther?" 2 hours, perhaps less. Thomas studied her face. "We should approach with caution. Watch for signs of followers." "Do you think we've been tracked this far?" Thomas's expression was grave. "I do not know. But Thorn is persistent, and he has had time to gather allies." He turned his horse down the slope. "Come, we will circle to approach from the east, where the ridge provides better cover." They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Martha's mind raced between joy at the prospect of reuniting with her children and anxiety about what would follow. The settlement Thomas had mentioned remained a vague possibility, neither embraced nor rejected. First, as he had reminded her, she must see her children, hold them, assure herself of their safety. Then decisions could be made. As they drew closer to the valley, Thomas signaled for them to dismount. They led the horses on foot for the final mile, staying within the tree line that bordered the eastern ridge. The camp gradually came into clearer focus. A collection of perhaps a dozen structures, some traditional hogans, others more permanent log cabins built in the white settler style. People moved among them, women carrying baskets or tending cook fires, men working with horses or wood. "My sister's dwelling is there," Thomas said, pointing to a cabin on the settlement's northern edge. "The one with the red blanket hanging outside." Martha's eyes found it immediately, a sturdy log structure with smoke curling from a stone chimney, and, as Thomas had indicated, a bright red trade blanket hanging beside the door like a flag. Her heart began to pound so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. "Wait here," Thomas instructed, handing her the reins of both horses. "I will go first, make sure all is well." Martha wanted to protest, to run headlong into the camp calling her children's names, but she recognized the wisdom in his caution. She nodded, gripping the leather reins so tightly her knuckles whitened. "How will I know if something's wrong?" she asked, suddenly afraid. Thomas considered this. "If there is danger, I will raise both arms above my head. If all is well, I will simply wave once." He gestured to a large boulder near the tree line. "Stay behind that. Watch, but remain hidden until I signal." Martha nodded, leading the horses to the boulder and tethering them to a small pine. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched behind the stone, peering around its edge to keep Thomas in sight. Thomas moved down the slope with the same silent efficiency she had come to expect from him, alert and watchful, despite the apparent peace of the scene below. Martha watched as he entered the camp, noting how several people greeted him with raised hands or words she couldn't hear. A small child ran up to him, tugging at his buckskin leggings, and Thomas paused to crouch at the child's level, listening gravely to whatever was being said. The interaction sent a pang through Martha's heart, such a normal, peaceful moment, so at odds with the violence and fear of the past days. Thomas straightened and continued walking, speaking briefly with a tall woman wearing a bright blue skirt. Martha studied the woman, noting her straight posture and the authoritative way she gestured as she spoke. His sister, perhaps? The resemblance was visible even at this distance. The same high cheekbones, the same deliberate way of moving. After what felt like an eternity of conversation, Thomas continued to the cabin with the red blanket. Martha held her breath as he disappeared inside. Seconds stretched into minutes. The horses shifted restlessly beside her, the mare nickering softly as if sensing her tension. Then the cabin door opened again, and Thomas emerged. But he wasn't alone. A small figure darted past him, running toward the trees where Martha waited hidden. A girl in a faded blue dress, her dark hair streaming behind her. "Sarah," Martha whispered, her voice breaking on the name. Another figure followed, taller, moving with the awkward gait of a boy on the cusp of manhood, trying to appear dignified while clearly fighting the urge to run. "Daniel," Martha choked, tears blurring her vision. Thomas raised his hand and waved once, then pointed directly to where she hid. The children followed his gesture, squinting toward the tree line. She couldn't wait any longer. Abandoning the horses, she broke from the tree line and half ran, half stumbled, down the slope toward her children, arms outstretched, her husband's name on her lips, her heart both breaking and healing with each step toward home. "Mama!" Sarah's voice carried across the distance, high and clear as a bell. The girl broke into a full sprint, her small legs pumping furiously, arms outstretched like wings. Behind her, Daniel's careful composure fractured. He ran too, long limbs eating. Up the ground between them, his face transformed by joy and relief. Martha fell to her knees as they reached her, opening her arms wide to receive them both. Sarah crashed into her first, nearly bowling her over with the force of her embrace, burying her face in Martha's neck with a sob. Daniel followed a heartbeat later, his arms encircling them both, his body shaking with silent tears. "You came." Back," Sarah hiccuped against her shoulder. "You came back." "I told her you would," Daniel said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I knew you would." Martha held them fiercely, drinking in the smell of their hair, the warmth of their bodies, the miracle of their presence. For a moment, the past days of terror receded, washed away by the pure, overwhelming relief of reunion. "Let me look at you," she said finally, drawing back just enough to see their faces. "Are you hurt? Are you well?" Sarah's face was tear-streaked but radiant with happiness. Daniel had a small cut above one eyebrow that hadn't been there when she left, but otherwise appeared unharmed. Both looked thinner, their eyes shadowed by worry, but fundamentally whole. "We're fine, Ma," Daniel assured her, straightening his shoulders as if suddenly remembering he was supposed to be the man of the family. "Mr. Black Fox's people have been good to us. They gave us a place to sleep and food to eat, and the lady with the blue skirt taught me to make bread," Sarah added, her natural exuberance returning. "And I helped with the babies, and Daniel learned how to—" "Sarah," Daniel interrupted with brotherly impatience, "let me breathe." Martha laughed through her tears, cupping her daughter's cheek. "There will be time for all your stories," she promised. "All of them." She looked up to find Thomas standing a few paces away, watching their reunion with an expression that for once wasn't entirely guarded. Something like satisfaction, perhaps even happiness, softened his usually stoic features. "Thank you," she said, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. He nodded once, accepting what couldn't be fully expressed. "Come," he said gently. "My sister waits to welcome you properly. There is food and a place to rest." Martha stood, keeping one arm around each child, unwilling to break contact even for a moment. As they walked together toward the Navajo camp, she felt a curious sensation. Not safety exactly, for she knew danger still lurked at the edges of their world, but something like belonging. A place in a story that was still being written. "Mr. Black Fox says you were very brave, Ma," Daniel said quietly as they walked. Martha looked ahead to where Thomas led them down the slope, his tall figure moving with that fluid grace that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "Not as brave as you," she replied, squeezing her son's shoulder, "finding help when you need it." That takes real courage." Daniel's chest swelled slightly at the praise, though he tried to hide it. "I just did what Pa would have done," he said. Martha felt tears threaten again. "Yes," she agreed softly, "exactly what he would have done." As they approached the camp, people emerged from their dwellings, women with curious eyes, men with cautious nods, children peeking from behind their elders' legs. Thomas spoke to them in his native tongue, gesturing occasionally toward Martha and her children. Whatever he said seemed to satisfy their curiosity. Many smiled or nodded in welcome. The woman in the blue skirt, Thomas's sister Anna, stepped forward, her face solemn but not unfriendly. She said something to Thomas, who translated, "My sister says you and your children are welcome in her home. She has prepared a meal and heated water for washing." Martha bowed her head slightly in gratitude. "Please tell her we are honored by her hospitality." Thomas relayed this, and Anna's expression warmed slightly. She gestured toward her cabin, inviting them to enter. As Martha guided her children toward this unexpected haven, she caught Thomas watching her. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. This was not an ending, but a beginning. For better or worse, their paths had become intertwined in ways neither could have foreseen. Martha stepped across the threshold of Anna's cabin, her children beside her, and into whatever future awaited them all. The interior of Anna's cabin was a revelation to Martha, a harmonious blending of Navajo traditions and elements borrowed from white settlers. Hand-woven rugs in intricate patterns covered the packed earth floor, their vivid reds and golds warming the space. A traditional loom stood in one corner, a half-finished blanket stretched across its frame. The stone fireplace, clearly built by someone familiar with European techniques, occupied the center of the back wall, its chimney drawing smoke efficiently upward rather than relying on a ceiling hole like traditional hogans. Most surprising was the cast-iron cook stove, a luxury Martha herself had never owned, that sat proudly near the fireplace. Above it hung an array of cooking implements, copper pots, iron skillets, wooden spoons, worn smooth with use. Anna gestured for them to sit at a low table surrounded by cushions. Daniel and Sarah hesitated, looking to Martha for guidance in this unfamiliar setting. "It's all right," she assured them, lowering herself onto one of the cushions. "This is how our hosts honor us." The children followed her example, though Daniel sat stiffly, his posture betraying his discomfort with the new arrangements. Sarah, more adaptable, settled easily and looked around with undisguised curiosity. Thomas spoke briefly to his sister, who nodded and began ladling a fragrant stew from the pot hanging over the fire into wooden bowls. Martha breathed in the aroma. Venison. Oh, she thought, with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify. "My sister asks if your children are hungry," Thomas translated, though the question hardly needed asking. Daniel and Sarah were already eyeing the food with the intensity of young people who had known real hunger. "Yes, thank you," Martha replied, accepting a bowl with a nod of gratitude. As Anna served them, Martha noticed another woman sitting quietly in the corner, younger, perhaps 20, with a sleeping infant wrapped against her chest. Catching Martha's glance, Thomas explained, "My sister's daughter Luyu. Her husband is hunting with the men to the north." Martha nodded, offering a smile to the young mother, who returned it shyly before returning her attention to her sleeping child. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the simple reverence for food that comes from having gone without. The stew was delicious, rich and hearty, the meat tender, the broth seasoned with unfamiliar spices that tingled pleasantly on Martha's tongue. "Daniel," Martha said finally, when her initial hunger had been satisfied, "tell me what happened after I left. How did you find Thomas and his people?" Daniel set down his spoon, his young face solemn as he gathered his thoughts. Despite everything, Martha felt a surge of pride at his composure. At 11, he carried himself with a dignity beyond his years. After you didn't come back the second day, I knew something was wrong, he began. You said 3 days at most. When the third day came and went, he swallowed hard. Sarah wanted to wait longer, but I remembered what Pa always said. When trouble comes, don't wait for it to find you, Martha finished softly. It had been one of Thomas Caldwell's favorite admonitions, Daniel nodded. I knew we couldn't stay in the cabin, not alone. So I packed what food we had left, Pa's rifle and some blankets, told Sarah we were going to find help. Daniel said we had to be very quiet. Sarah chimed in, her words tumbling out in excitement. We hid when some men came to the cabin, 2 of them with scary faces. Martha's blood ran cold. Men came to our cabin? Daniel nodded grimly. Night of the 4th day, we were already hiding in the root cellar. They broke down the door, took what they wanted. You said things. He glanced at Sarah and didn't finish the sentence. They were looking for you, Ma. Thorne's men, Martha realized with a chill. They'd been hunting her family, even as she was being taken in the opposite direction. You did exactly right, she told him, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Both of you. We waited till morning, then followed your wagon tracks, Daniel continued. I figured you'd gone to the trading post and something happened on the way back. Martha listened with growing amazement and horror as Daniel recounted their journey. 2 children alone in the wilderness, navigating by the sun and his rudimentary understanding of tracking, sleeping in hollows and under overhangs to avoid. Being seen, they'd found her abandoned wagon on the 2nd day, ransacked and broken. I saw the signs of a struggle, Daniel said, his voice dropping, and hoofprints leading southwest. That's when I knew you'd been taken, he cried, Sarah added matter-of-factly. But only a little bit, when he thought I was asleep. Daniel flushed, shooting his sister an annoyed look. I didn't cry, he muttered. I was thinking. Thomas, who had been listening silently, spoke for the first time. There is no shame in tears when a family is in danger, only in giving up. Daniel's gaze shifted to Thomas, something like hero worship in his eyes. Martha realized with a start how powerful an impression the Navajo hunter must have made on her fatherless son, a man of courage and skill who had appeared like a guardian spirit when all seemed lost. How did you find Thomas's people? Martha prompted gently. We kept following the tracks, Daniel explained. 2 more days. But they got harder to see. Then we ran out of food. His voice faltered slightly. I shot at a rabbit but missed. Wasted one of our 6 bullets. That night, he trailed off, looking at Sarah. I got sick, Sarah said softly. Really hot. Daniel carried me. Martha's heart was constricted. She reached out, pulling Sarah against her side, feeling her solid, warm presence, as if to reassure herself that the danger had passed. We were near Split Rock Creek, Daniel continued. I knew because Pa took me hunting there once. I remembered there was a trail nearby that the Indians used. Thought maybe. He shrugged. It was all I could think of. My hunting party found them near sundown, Thomas added. The boy was carrying his sister, had been for miles. His feet were bleeding through his boots. Martha closed her eyes briefly, imagining the scene, her son staggering through the wilderness, determined to save them both, refusing to admit defeat, even as his own strength failed. Daniel told us of your capture, Thomas continued. Describe the men and their direction accurately. While my sister's family cared for the children, I tracked the raiders. The rest, Martha knew, Thomas's patient tracking, his careful observation of the outlaws' camp, his precise strike when the moment was right. What still amazed her was that he had done it at all, risked his life for a white woman he'd never met, based solely on a debt of honor and a child's desperate plea. You saved us all, Martha said quietly, meeting Thomas's dark gaze. There's no way I can repay that. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. There is no debt between us, he replied. Your husband saved my cousin. You raised a son with courage. The circle is complete. Anna spoke then, a flowing stream of words in her native tongue. Thomas listened, nodding occasionally, then turned to Martha. "My sister says you and your children are welcome to stay until you are fully recovered. The camp moves to winter grounds in 2 weeks. By then, you must decide your path." Martha nodded, understanding the generous but practical offer. The Navajo couldn't be expected to take permanent responsibility for 3 white settlers, especially with winter approaching and resources growing scarce. "Please thank her," Martha replied, "and tell her I hope to be useful while we're here. I can cook, sew, help with the children, whatever is needed." When Thomas translated this, Anna's expression warmed. She responded with a nod and a few words. "She says tomorrow is soon enough for work," Thomas translated. "Tonight is for healing and rest." As if on cue, Sarah yawned widely. The events of the day and the warm food conspiring to overcome her excitement. Martha realized her own exhaustion was settling in as well, the adrenaline of reunion giving way to bone-deep weariness. Anna rose and gestured toward a curtained alcove at the rear of the cabin, speaking again to Thomas. "She has prepared sleeping places for you and the children," he explained. "I will leave you to rest." Martha felt a sudden reluctance at the thought of his departure. Foolish, she told herself. They were safe now, surrounded by his people, no longer dependent on his protection. Yet the prospect of facing the night without his steady presence nearby left her oddly bereft. "You'll return tomorrow?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its implications. Thomas paused at the door, studying her with those fathomless dark eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "we have much to discuss." After he left, Anna showed them to the sleeping alcove, where 3 thick pallets of soft furs had been arranged on a raised platform. Clean clothing had been laid out, simple garments of soft-tanned deerskin for Martha and Daniel, a small dress of trade cloth for Sarah. Martha helped her children change, marveling at how thin they had become in just a week. Sarah's collarbones jutted sharply beneath her skin, and Daniel's wrists extended too far from his sleeves. The separation had taken its toll on all of them. "Are we going home soon, Ma?" Sarah asked as Martha tucked a blanket around her. Martha hesitated, unprepared for the question, though she should have anticipated it. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "Our cabin might not be safe right now." "Because of the bad men?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "Yes," Martha confirmed, smoothing her daughter's hair, "but we're safe here, and we'll figure out what comes next together." "We could go to Aunt Ida's in Missouri," Daniel suggested from his pallet, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "She wrote last spring that we could visit." Martha nodded non-committally. Ida was Thomas Caldwell's sister, a good woman married to a prosperous farmer outside Springfield. She had indeed extended an invitation, but the journey would be long and treacherous, especially with winter coming and their resources depleted. "We'll think about all our options," she promised. "Now sleep. We're together, and that's what matters most." Sarah was already drifting off, her small face relaxed in sleep for the first time in days. Daniel fought it longer, his eyes fixed on Martha, as if afraid she might disappear if he closed them. "I won't leave you again," she assured him softly. "Promise?" he whispered, sounding younger than his years. "Promise." She leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Sleep now." Finally alone, Martha changed into the deerskin dress, grateful to be free of her torn and filthy clothing. The soft leather felt strange against her skin, but the garment was well made and comfortable. Anna had left a small clay bowl of water and a clean cloth, and Martha washed her face and hands, wincing as the water revealed cuts and bruises she hadn't even been aware of. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. She sat at the small window, cut into the cabin wall, looking out at the Navajo camp as darkness settled over it. Cook fires glowed, casting long shadows as people moved between dwellings. Children were called in for the night, dogs barked and settled, horses nickered softly from a corral at the valley's edge. It was a community, something their isolated homestead had never truly been, for all Thomas Caldwell's dreams of building a life there. Here, people lived together, protected one another, shared resources and knowledge. Even as an outsider, Martha could see the strength in their connections. Her thoughts turned to Thomas's mention of the settlement in the western mountains, Shadowbrook, the place between worlds, a place where different peoples had found a way to coexist, to build something new from the fragments of their separate traditions. Was such a thing really possible? Or was it merely a beautiful fiction, a mirage that would vanish when examined too closely? Martha touched the silver locket at her throat, thinking of her husband's face the day they had set out from Missouri, his eyes alight with visions of independence and prosperity on their own land. He had been a good man, brave and hard-working, but perhaps too solitary in his thinking, too certain that a man, a woman, and their children could face the frontier alone. A soft knock at the cabin door roused her from her reverie. Anna answered it, exchanging quiet words with someone outside. A moment later, she approached Martha with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Thomas," she said, one of the few English words she seemed to know, gesturing toward the door. Martha unwrapped the bundle to find a knife, not a crude hunting blade, but a beautifully crafted weapon with a bone handle carved in flowing patterns and a gleaming steel blade. A replacement for the one she'd lost during her capture, she realized. But it was more than that. Among frontier peoples, a knife was not merely a tool, but a statement of identity and capability. To give someone a knife was to acknowledge their right to self-defense, their status as an equal. Coming from Thomas, the gift carried particular significance. Martha wrapped the knife carefully in its cloth and set it beside her pallet. Tomorrow, she decided, she would thank him properly, and perhaps, in the clear light of day, they would begin to chart a course toward whatever future awaited them. She lay down at last between her sleeping children, listening to their steady breathing, feeling the rise and fall of their small bodies. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly rest, surrendering to a sleep unmarked by fear. Outside, the night creatures sang their ancient songs. Inside, a mother and her children breathed in unison, their heartbeats a steady rhythm of life, continuing, enduring, finding its way forward through darkness toward dawn. Morning announced itself with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee, voices murmuring in a language Martha didn't understand, but was beginning to recognize the cadence of. She opened her eyes to find Sarah already up, seated cross-legged beside Luyu near the fire, watching with fascination as the young woman demonstrated some kind of string game with nimble fingers. Daniel was gone from his pallet, but his presence was evident in the neatly folded blanket and the absence of his borrowed clothing. Always responsible, always eager to prove his worth. Martha rose quietly, slipping on the deerskin dress and running, her fingers through her tangled hair in a futile attempt to bring it to order. Anna noticed her movements and approached with a carved wooden comb and a small pot of what appeared to be some kind of oil. "Hair," she said in heavily accented English, pantomiming combining motions. Martha accepted gratefully, allowing the older woman to apply the fragrant oil to her hair and work through the knots with patient, gentle strokes. It had been years since anyone had tended to her in this way, a simple act of care between women that transcended their language barrier. When Anna finished, she patted Martha's shoulder and pointed toward the door, where voices could be heard approaching. A moment later, it swung open to reveal Thomas and Daniel, carrying an assortment of tools and materials. Daniel's face was flushed with pride and exertion. "Ma!" he called excitedly. "Mr. Black Fox is teaching me to make arrows. Real ones with stone points and eagle feathers." Martha smiled at his enthusiasm, but her eyes were drawn to Thomas. In the clear morning light, he looked different somehow, more accessible, less the mysterious savior, and more simply, a man. He wore a blue cotton shirt today instead of buckskins, though the red bandana still circled his throat, and his black hair was tied back neatly at the nape of his neck. "Good morning," she greeted them both. "You've been busy early?" The boy. "As good hands," Thomas replied, setting down his burden of tools. "Quick to learn." Daniel beamed at the praise, setting his own armful of arrow shafts carefully against the wall. "Thomas says, Mr. Black Fox says I should know how to make weapons that don't need bullets, in case we ever run out again." Martha nodded, understanding the wisdom in this. Ammunition was precious and finite on the frontier. The ability to create renewable weapons could mean the difference between hunger and survival. A wise lesson, she agreed. "And it's all right to call him Thomas if he's given you permission." Daniel nodded earnestly. "He said I could. He said, men who hunt together use their given names." Thomas had moved to speak with his sister, but Martha caught the glance he sent her way, a silent acknowledgement of what the simple permission meant to her son. A boy without a father, being initiated into the skills and customs of manhood by a worthy teacher. It was a gift beyond measure. Anna set out a breakfast of corn cakes, dried berries, and more of the strong, dark coffee that seemed to be a concession to her white brother's tastes. As they ate, Thomas outlined what they knew of the situation beyond the camp's boundaries. "Scouts returned last night," he reported. "Thorne and 2 men were seen near Split Rock Creek, asking questions at a trapper's cabin. They still search for you." Martha's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "And the others? The deserters or bounty hunters you saw?" "They have moved north, back toward Army territory. Perhaps they decided the risk was not worth the reward." Thomas's expression was grave. "But Thorne is different. This has become personal for him." Martha thought of the massive outlaw, his brutish face twisted with anger when she'd fought back. Yes, for Thorne, this was no longer simply about money. It was about a woman who had defied him, who had escaped when he believed her helpless. "How long will he look?" she asked. "Until he finds you," Thomas replied bluntly. "Or until something more valuable draws his attention elsewhere." Martha glanced at her children, Sarah still engrossed in learning Luyu's string game, Daniel listening intently to the adult conversation while trying to appear casual. These were the stakes. Their safety, their future, perhaps their very lives. Then, "We can't stay here," she said quietly. "We'll only bring danger to your people." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "That decision is not yet urgent. The camp moves soon to winter grounds, deeper in the mountains. Thorne would not find it easily." "And after winter," Martha pressed. "What then?" Thomas's eyes held hers, dark and unreadable. "After winter," he said slowly, "many paths may open, or close. The season will bring its own wisdom." Martha understood what he was offering, not a permanent solution, but time. Time to recover, to plan, to consider options without the pressure of immediate decision. It was more than she had expected, and gratitude welled within her. "Thank you for the knife," she said, changing the subject to one less weighted with uncertainty. "It's beautiful." A hint of something like pleasure crossed Thomas's normally stoic features. "It was my father's," he said simply. "He would approve of it passing to your hands." The significance of the gift struck Martha anew. Not simply a replacement weapon, but a family heirloom, freely given to an outsider. Before she could formulate a response worthy of such honor, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices were raised in alarm, followed by the pounding of hooves. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the door with fluid grace. Martha followed, heart pounding, Daniel close behind her. Outside, riders were approaching the camp at a gallop, not white men, but Navajo warriors, their horses lathered with exertion. They called out as they rode, their voices urgent. Martha didn't need to understand their words to recognize a warning when she heard one. Beside her, Thomas had gone very still, his expression hardening into grim lines as he listened. "What is it?" she asked, dread coiling in her stomach. "What's happening?" Thomas turned to her, his dark eyes filled with a cold anger that made her step back involuntarily. "The army," he said. "A full company, moving south from Fort Bradley. With them rides a man the scouts describe as very large, with a bandaged hand." "Thorn," Martha whispered. Thomas nodded once, his jaw tight. "They carry eviction notices for all Navajo settlements in this valley, and warrants for 3 white fugitives, a woman and 2 children, charged with horse theft and murder." The camp erupted into organized chaos. Women gathered children and began packing essential supplies, while men gathered weapons and conferred in tight clusters, their faces grim with resolve. Martha stood frozen for a moment, the implications of Thomas's words sinking in like cold. Lead in her veins, murder, horse theft, warrants. Somehow Thorn had not only tracked them, but had twisted the truth into a noose for her and her children. How? She finally managed. How could he convince the army to help him? Thomas's expression was thunderous. "The commander at Fort Bradley is new, Captain Ellis Hargrove, known for ambition, not wisdom." His hand moved unconsciously to the knife at his belt. "And gold speaks a language all men understand. They're coming here. Now?" Daniel asked, his young face pale but determined. Thomas nodded once. "The scouts estimate they are half a day's ride south. 20 soldiers, perhaps more." Martha felt dizzy with the speed at which their brief sanctuary was collapsing. Just hours ago, she had allowed herself to believe they might be safe, at least, and for a time. Now they were not only in danger again, but had brought that danger to the very people who had sheltered them. Anna appeared beside them, speaking rapidly to Thomas. Her calm efficiency was at odds with the urgency of her words, her hands never stopping as she tied bundles and organized supplies, even while planning. "My sister says we must leave within the hour," Thomas translated. "The winter camp can be reached in 2 days if we travel hard. The path through Thunder Canyon is known only to our people." "Your people are leaving because of us," Martha said, the guilt almost overwhelming. "This is our fault." Thomas's gaze was steady. "The army was coming regardless. The eviction notices were already signed. You and your children simply gave them a convenient excuse." "Even so, Ma," Daniel interrupted, his voice stronger than Martha had ever heard it. "We can't stay here, not if it means putting people in danger who helped us." Martha looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the echo of his father in the set of his jaw, the determined glint in his eye. Thomas Caldwell had possessed that same stubborn bravery, sometimes foolhardy, always sincere. "You're right," she acknowledged. Turning to Thomas, she asked, "What do we do?" "We separate," he replied immediately. "The camp moves north toward winter grounds. You, the children, and I go west." "West? Toward Shadowbrook?" Thomas nodded. "It gives us the best chance. The army will expect you to flee with the tribe or return to your homestead." Martha glanced at her children. Sarah had joined them, clinging to her mother's skirt, her small face solemn as she sensed the gravity of the adults' conversation. "Will it be dangerous?" "Yes," Thomas answered without hesitation, "but less dangerous than staying or trying to outrun false charges." Anna spoke again, pressing a small bundle into Thomas's hands. He opened it briefly. "Supplies," Martha realized. "Food, a water skin, small packets of herbs or medicines. My sister says to tell you that you have allies here, whatever comes," Thomas translated. "These people do not forget those who stand with them, nor those who move against them." Martha met Anna's eyes directly, seeing in them a strength and dignity that transcended their different backgrounds. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Anna clasped Martha's hand briefly, squeezing it in silent communication, then turned to continue her preparations. The next 40 minutes passed, in a blur of activity. Martha helped her children change into clothing better suited for hard travel. Buckskin leggings and sturdy moccasins for Daniel, a simple dress and soft boots for Sarah. Thomas prepared 4 horses, packing minimal supplies on each: water, dried food, blankets, weapons. No luxuries, nothing that would slow their escape. As Martha rolled her few possessions into a blanket, she noticed Luyu approaching, the young woman's infant now awake and watching the commotion with solemn dark eyes. Luyu hesitated, then held out a small deerskin pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "For a good journey," she said in halting English, pressing it into Martha's hand. Martha opened it to find a small carved figure, a woman with her arms outstretched, crafted from polished red stone. A protection charm, she realized, deeply moved. Made the gesture from a mother to a mother. "Thank you," she said, hoping her expression conveyed what her limited words could not. Luyu smiled slightly, touching the top of Sarah's head in blessing before turning back to her own preparations. Outside, the camp was nearly emptied, families already departing in small groups, traveling in different directions to make pursuit more difficult. Thomas waited with the horses, speaking in low tones with several older men who nodded gravely at whatever instructions or information he shared. Martha approached, children in tow, ready to depart. Thomas handed her the reins to a spotted mare with gentle eyes. "She is steady," he explained, "good for long journeys." Daniel received a smaller pinto, its black and white markings vivid against the morning sun. Sarah would ride with Martha, at least until they were clear of immediate danger. "The others go north," Thomas explained, mounting his own horse, a powerful black stallion that shifted impatiently beneath him. "We rode west for half a day, then cut north toward Thunder Canyon. It will confuse any trackers." Martha settled Sarah in front of her on the saddle, feeling the child's small body tense with excitement and fear. "How long until Shadowbrook?" 4 days if the weather holds," Thomas replied, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Longer if it doesn't." Daniel looked up from adjusting his stirrups. "What if the soldiers follow us instead of the main group?" It was a perceptive question, one that indicated Daniel had been thinking strategically despite his youth. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement of the boy's insight. "Then we adapt," he answered simply, "but they will likely follow the larger party first. Army commanders prefer clear victories over uncertain chases." With final farewells exchanged, a quick embrace between Thomas and his sister, a solemn hand-clasp with the tribal elders, they set out, riding west across the valley toward distant foothills shrouded in morning mist. Martha did not look back, could not bear to see the dissolution of the community that had welcomed them so briefly. They rode hard through the morning, stopping only once to water the horses at a shallow stream that cut across their path. Thomas remained vigilant, frequently standing in his stirrups to scan their back trail for signs of pursuit. By midday, they had reached the foothills. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, the horses picking their way carefully through boulder fields and across steep ravines. Sarah, initially chatty with questions about their journey, had fallen silent, lulled by the rocking motion of the horse and the warmth of her mother's arms around her. "How did you learn the army was coming?" Martha asked during a brief pause to rest the horses. "Your scouts must have been watching the fort." Thomas nodded, passing her a water skin. "Always. When you live beside those who would take everything, you must know their movements before they make them." "And Thorn? How did he find his way to the army?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Men like Thorn always find allies in power. They speak the same language of greed and control, though they dress it in different words." Martha considered this, recognizing the truth in it. How often had she seen it in her own life? the wealthy landowner back in Missouri who had driven smaller farmers from their land through dubious legal maneuvers, the territorial officials who ignored attacks on native settlements while responding instantly to complaints from white settlers. Shadowbrook sounds different, she observed, a place where people choose a better way. Thomas's gaze met hers, something like approval warming his usually stoic features. It began as a necessity, he explained. Outcasts finding common ground. It continues because those who live there discovered that what unites them is stronger than what divides them. And you, are you part of this settlement? I trade there, bring news, supplies. My cousin's wife's family lives within the walls. Thomas adjusted his bandana, a gesture Martha had come to recognize as a sign he was considering his words carefully. I have been offered a place there, many times. But you haven't accepted, Martha noted. No. He didn't elaborate, and Martha didn't press. Some choices were too personal to explain to relative strangers, no matter how much shared danger had compressed their acquaintance. They continued westward through the afternoon, the terrain growing increasingly challenging. Thomas led them through narrow passes where the horses had to walk single file, along precarious ledges that made Martha's heart race whenever she glanced down at the drops beside them. Sarah had awakened from her drowse and now sat alert, occasionally pointing out interesting rocks or birds with the resilient curiosity of childhood. Daniel rode just behind them, handling his mount with growing confidence. Martha caught him watching, Thomas intently, studying the Navajo man's posture, his handling of the reins, the way he read the terrain ahead. Learning, always learning, storing away knowledge that might someday mean the difference between survival and death. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Thomas led them into a narrow canyon, where a small waterfall spilled into a clear pool. The walls rose high on three sides, providing natural shelter and limiting approaches. We camp here, he announced. Good water, good defense. They dismounted, stiff from hours in the saddle. While Thomas tended to the horses, Martha helped the children gather firewood from the sparse vegetation that clung to the canyon walls. Daniel took to the task with serious intent, selecting only the driest branches, while Sarah treated it as a treasure hunt, proudly presenting each small twig she discovered. Thomas built a small, nearly smokeless fire in a ring of stones and prepared a simple meal of dried meat reconstituted in hot water with wild onions he'd gathered along their route. They ate in relative silence, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them all. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled against Martha's side like a small woodland creature seeking warmth. Daniel lasted longer, his eyes heavy, but his determination to remain alert, evident in the way he periodically shook himself awake. Sleep, Daniel, Martha urged gently. Tomorrow will be another long day. The boy resisted at first, then finally gave in to exhaustion, stretching, out on his blanket near the fire. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Alone with Thomas in the gathering darkness, Martha felt a curious mixture of vulnerability and strength. The danger surrounding them remained acute, yet something about his steady presence calmed the worst of her fears. "Thank you," she said softly, careful not to wake the children, "for everything you've done for us. I know your people are risking much by helping us escape." Thomas fed another small branch to the fire, his profile strong against the flames. "My people understand what it means to be hunted for existing," he replied, "to have truth twisted into lies by those with power." "The eviction notices," Martha said. "Has this happened before?" "Many times. Different papers, different words, same meaning. Leave or be removed." His voice held no self-pity, only a deep weariness. "Each time we find new places. Each time they decide those places are also theirs." Martha thought of her own homestead, the pride she and Thomas Caldwell had felt in claiming a piece of land as their own. Had someone else considered that land theirs first? Almost certainly. The thought brought a flush of shame she had never before considered. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted quietly. Thomas glanced at her. "Why would you? Your people write the stories, draw the maps, make the laws." There was no accusation in his tone, simply a statement of fact. But Martha felt the weight of history in his words, the vast, complex web of injustices that had led them to this moment, this fire, this flight. "If we reach Shadowbrook," she ventured, "what then?" "For us, I mean." Thomas was silent for a long moment, stoking the fire with methodical care. "The settlement votes on new arrivals," he explained finally. "Council of 7, 3 native, 3 white, 1 Mexican. They will hear your story, decide if you and your children can stay, and if they say no." "They won't," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "Not once they understand what you've endured. Not once they meet Daniel and see his courage." Martha smiled, faintly at the mention of her son. "He admires you greatly, you know. In just days, you've filled a void he's carried since his father died." If she expected Thomas to dismiss the observation or change the subject, he surprised her. "He is a good boy," he acknowledged. "Much potential. Listen well, watch closely. He would thrive in a place like Shadowbrook, where he could learn from many traditions." "And Sarah?" Martha asked, glancing at her sleeping daughter. "The valley, as other children her age. A small school, gardens where she could learn to grow food as your people do, and medicines as mine do." A hint of something like wistfulness colored his voice. She would forget in time the fear of these days. The image he painted was seductive in its promise of security and community. Martha allowed herself just for a moment to envision a future there. Daniel apprenticed to a skilled hunter or craftsman, Sarah playing with children of different backgrounds, herself contributing to a community that valued all its members. "And you?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its implications. "Would you stay this time? Accept the place they've offered you?" Thomas's dark eyes reflected the firelight as he regarded her steadily. "Perhaps," he said finally, "if there were enough." The moments stretched between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Martha looked away first, suddenly aware of how much had changed in the brief days since this man had entered their lives. How quickly boundaries had shifted, assumptions had crumbled. "We should both rest," she said, retreating to safer ground. "I can take a watch if you'd like." Thomas shook his head. "Sleep. I will wake you before dawn." Martha settled beside her children, drawing her blanket around her shoulders against the night's growing chill. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Her mind raced with the day's events, with the uncertainties that lay ahead, with the strange new feelings stirring within her. Across the fire, Thomas sat motionless, his back straight, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond their small circle of light guarding them. As he had since the moment Daniel had stumbled into his hunting party, a desperate boy carrying his sister, seeking help for his captured mother. Eventually, Martha drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams a chaotic blend of pursuit and sanctuary. Somewhere in the night, she thought she heard Thomas singing softly, a low melodic chant in his native tongue that seemed to weave protection around their small camp. Whether real or dreamed, the sound followed her down into deeper rest, a thread of comfort in the darkness. She woke to Thomas's hand on her shoulder, the pre-dawn air sharp with cold. The fire had burned down to embers, and the children still slept soundly, untroubled by the early rising. "Something's wrong," Thomas said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Horses are restless." Martha was instantly alert, the cobwebs of sleep vanishing as danger reasserted itself. "Soldiers, perhaps, or something else." Thomas was already checking his weapons, knife, bow, the old army revolver he carried but rarely displayed. "Stay with the children. I'll scout the canyon entrance." Before Martha could protest, he had melted into the shadows, moving with that uncanny silence she had witnessed before. She reached for the knife he had given her, its weight reassuring in her palm, as she positioned herself between her sleeping children and whatever threat might be approaching. Minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, straining to hear anything beyond the soft breathing of Daniel and Sarah, the occasional stamp of a nervous horse. The sky was lightening almost imperceptibly, transforming the blackness to a deep indigo that did little to illuminate the canyon's depths. A soft sound, not quite a whistle, not quite a bird call, came from the direction Thomas had gone. A signal, Martha realized, but warning of danger or all clear. Her question was answered moments later when Thomas reappeared, his expression grim in the faint light. "Riders," he confirmed. 6, maybe 7, moving fast along our trail." "Army?" Martha asked, already moving to wake the children. Thomas shook his head. "No uniforms, armed men on army horses." His mouth was set in a hard line. "Thorne found people even more ruthless than himself. Mercenaries, bounty hunters." Martha's blood ran cold. "How did they find us so quickly?" "They didn't follow us directly," Thomas replied, gathering their supplies with swift efficiency. "They guessed our destination. Someone told them about Shadowbrook." The betrayal hung in the air. Between them, its implications dire. Someone connected to Fort Bradley knew about the secret settlement. Someone had revealed its location, perhaps hoping to collect a reward for the capture of a murderer and her children. "How long do we have?" Martha asked, shaking Daniel gently awake. "An hour. Less." Thomas was already saddling the horses. "There's another way to the settlement, harder, through the high country." Daniel sat up, instantly alert despite the early hour. "What's happening?" "Men are coming," Martha explained, keeping her voice steady for his sake. "We need to move quickly and quietly." To his credit, the boy asked no further questions, immediately moving to help Sarah gather her few belongings while Martha rolled their blankets. Within minutes, they were mounted and following Thomas out of the canyon through a narrow cleft in the western wall she hadn't noticed the previous evening. As they emerged onto a high ridge, the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern peaks, illuminating a vast, rugged landscape of canyons and mesas stretching toward distant mountains wrapped in morning mist. Under different circumstances, Martha might have paused to appreciate the wild beauty of it. Now she saw only terrain to be crossed, obstacles to be overcome, potential hiding places from the men who hunted them. Thomas pointed toward a towering peak to the northwest, its summit lost in clouds. "Thunder Mountain," he said. "Shadowbrook lies in its shadow. 2 days' hard ride." "And our pursuers?" Martha asked, adjusting Sarah more securely before her in the saddle. Thomas's expression was unyielding as stone. "Will not find what they seek," he replied. "Not while I draw breath." With that grim promise hanging in the crisp morning air, he urged his horse forward along the ridge, leading them into the wildest country Martha had ever seen, and toward a confrontation that could not be avoided much longer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.